Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to folks on the East Coast. My name is Sarah Treuhaft. I'm Deputy Director at PolicyLink, and you are now participating in the webinar, Boost Your Campaigns with the Economic Case for Equity. Thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to talk about our agenda for the day and our speakers, and then I'm going to pass it on to Marsha Bonner, who's Director of Grantmaking at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, to introduce the webinar a little bit more. So today we're going to be talking about the narrative about the economic case for equity. That equity is the superior growth model narrative. Then we're going to talk about how people are using this narrative in their campaigns to drive policy action. And we'll have a really good amount of time for questions and discussion, probably 20 to 30 minutes of questions and discussion at the end. We really want to hear from you. And here are our speakers. First, it will be Marsha Bonner from the Marguerite Casey Foundation, then Angela Glover-Blackwell, the founder and CEO of PolicyLink. We'll talk about the framing. Jennifer Tran from PolicyLink will talk about how people are using this framing in community action campaigns. And there's me, I'm your moderator. I'm going to turn it over to Marsha Bonner now.
Good morning and good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. Again, I'm Marsha Bonner. I'm the Director of Grantmaking and Evaluation at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, and so I'd just like to say hello to all of our grantees who are participating today. We've done several of these sort of like resources to help the work locally for our grantees. In the fall, we had a Facebook chat with representatives from the White House on the Affordable Care Act, so we're delighted to be able to host this webinar with PolicyLink, who is one of our national grantees. And for those of you who don't know, PolicyLink is a national research and action institute that advances economic and social equity by lifting up what works. They have a very unique approach. Their work is grounded in the belief that policy must be informed by wisdom, voice, and experience of the low-income communities and communities of color who are closest to the nation's challenges and who are developing solutions to them. So they speak directly to the work that Marguerite Casey Foundation grantees are doing locally. They work with local and national partners to scale up these solutions through policy and work on many of the policy arenas in the Equal Voices platform that you're all working on, including jobs and workforce training, transportation, access to healthy food, affordable housing, and education. They also bring together equity advocates working across the country every 3 years at their equity summits to exchange strategies and ideas. And the reasoning behind this webinar is that the Foundation invited PolicyLink to host this for you because we think they have very useful ideas, research, and data that you can use in your campaigns. For the past few years, PolicyLink has been working to change the conversation about equity and advance the idea that we cannot have a strong economy unless we reduce inequality and ensure that everyone can participate and prosper, especially in the context of demographic shifts. This framing and data around the economic imperative of equity can be incredibly useful to advocates for making the case for your policy ask, as well as for engaging new allies, partners, families, and coalition members. And now I'd like to introduce Angela Glover-Blackwell, who's the founder and CEO of PolicyLink, who will explain a lot more about this approach. Thank you. Angela?
Hello, and thank you so much, Marsha, and welcome everybody to this, what I think is a really important discussion that helps us all to think about how to be more effective in our work. Those of us who have worked for years to improve the quality of life in low-income communities, to expand opportunity, to get rid of inequality, and to promote equity, I think have an amazing opportunity to pull all of our work together and attach it to national imperatives, which gives it a broader base of support, it makes it more compelling, and it actually gives us a framework from which to say there is no other way to go at this moment. And Marsha said it right. The big frame is that as the nation changes and people of color become the majority in the nation, we cannot continue to leave people behind who are of color and low income. And when we address those problems, we make the nation stronger. Equity is the superior growth model. We think that in order to frame that, we need to have just a series of arguments that we're always using as a frame for the particular thing that we're working on. I'm going to go through each one, but I want to tell you what the elements are of that frame. The face of America is changing. Diversity is increasing everywhere. The future is now. We know how to get ready for that future. Equity will make the economy stronger, and equitable growth is indeed possible. Let's start with the first. The face of America is changing. We are quickly becoming a nation in which the majority by 2042 will be people of color. People of color are already 37% of the population. And you can see that the nation is rapidly becoming a place where people of color are the majority or nearly the majority. By 2043, people of color will be the majority in this nation. If you look at the slide, America will be a majority people of color nation by 2043. If you just look at the part that is gray, that's the percentage of people who are white. And you can see this steady decrease, and you can see the steady increase of people of color. You can see that Latinos actually represent the largest group, that African Americans have remained steady, but when you look at remaining steady as a percentage and the general population of the nation is growing, it is clear that the numbers are growing. But what we often don't recognize is that diversity is everywhere. People are too quick to say, oh, well, that's just true in Los Angeles, or that's just true in Chicago. Oh, no, it's everywhere. And the slide that you're looking at shows that every place in the country by 2040 will experience this growth. And it's important for you to know, this is a wonderful talking point, from the census of 2000 to 2010, people of color accounted for 92% of the growth in the United States of America. The future, though, is not just out there. The future is now. Look at the maps that are before you. One on the left looks at the current population, 2010 census, 0 to 4. What is so interesting is when you look at the shaded areas, that looks almost identical, if not identical, to the map 2042. The children who are in 0 to 4 today represent the future. They represent the future, but the future is now. The children are already with us. In 2012, 51% of all babies born in the United States were of color. In 2013, children 0 to 5 became the majority of children in the country in that age group. By the end of this decade, the majority of children under 18 will be children of color. What we also know is that equity will make our nation stronger. When we think about the issues of equity, we know that we are at a point where skills account for everything. That the skills that you need in order to be competitive in this environment require at least a high school diploma. They really require an associate's degree. And in many cases, you need to have college or beyond to be able to demand the kind of salaries that we know families need to go forward. But let's just look at an associate's degree. By the year 2020, 47% of the jobs will require at least an associate's degree. That's 2 years of community college, 2 years of a skill training program. Right now, we know that only 28% of Black and Latinos have an associate's degree. Only 15% of Latino immigrants, 24% of Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. And so we can see that we have to really step up in order to get to the point where we can have a population that is prepared for the jobs of the future. We're not ready. If you think about education in terms of K-12, if you look at health disparities, looking at issues like obesity, if you think about the kinds of things in terms of having wealth beyond income, in each one of those areas, you will see a huge gap. Clearly, it's a problem for the people who are being left behind. But since the people who are being left behind are going to make up the future, the nation is not ready if the people who are going to be the future are not ready. It's good to frame it that way, to be able to pull everybody into the urgency of closing these gaps and making sure people are prepared to go forward. There's some people who think that the whole issue of equity has very little to do with the economy. As a matter of fact, there are many economists over the years who have said that inequality actually fuels growth. A notion, hard for me to believe this could have been accepted wisdom, but there was a notion that the more inequality you had, the more pressure people felt to work harder, the more they're going to contribute, and the more the economy will grow. Well, thank goodness, economists are now letting go of that idea, and many famous, respected economists now know that inequality is bad for growth. People like Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz, people like the White House economist Alan Kruger, people like the former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, all have come to this conclusion that inequality is bad for growth. As a matter of fact, the International Monetary Fund did a study of 100 countries and found that a 10% decrease in the country's inequality led to a 50% lengthening in the period of growth. Manuel Pasteur and his colleagues have done something similar in the United States, looking at 100 regions around the country, and found basically the same thing. So we know that inequality is bad for growth. What we need to also emphasize is that equity actually brings economic benefits. PolicyLink and the Center for American Progress did a book, which I'm sure you all are quite familiar with, called All in Nation. And in that book, we were able to demonstrate that if we reduce racial gaps in income, if we had done that in 2011, the GDP would have been $1.2 trillion higher. That indicates that the wealth of the nation would substantially increase if we would move forward with an equity agenda. We also know that diversity is good for growth. Equity is good for growth, and diversity is good for growth. The very people who are being left behind are people who bring incredible assets to growth and development. Businesses have figured this out. They are always trying to appeal to Latinos and African Americans and Asians because of the spending power that we have. But we also know that businesses that have an employee pool that's actually connected to the globe through language, through kinship, through travel, through relationships, bring tremendous assets to businesses. And we've always been inspired by the entrepreneurial spirit and desire among communities of color, and that is so important for growth and development. But you know, it's very interesting when you also talk to people about, well, you may be right, but the country's not ready for it, some people will say. Well, we know that equitable growth is possible because we've done polling, and we've polled the very kinds of investments that are important: education, job training, infrastructure. And the American people are more than ready. 71% of Americans support new steps to reduce racial and ethnic inequality. 69% of Americans agree that a bigger, more diverse workforce will lead to more economic growth. So we know it's possible because we have a base of people who are ready to embrace it. But we also know it's possible because over the years, you and your colleagues and so many of us working on these issues have developed strategies and policies that are exactly the ones that will contribute to equitable growth. We know we need to grow good jobs. That's one. And we have seen that there are efforts that ensure that when we're spending public policy, when we're spending public dollars, when we're making investments, that if we simultaneously think about how to grow good jobs, that that is good for the people who get those jobs and it's good for our regions. That's why we've had such a robust community benefits movement in this country, making sure that when we are making public investments that we're also thinking about how to promote equity. Recently in Oakland, California, big agreements were reached around what to do with the Oakland Army base that has just been just neglected, just nothing happening there for 25 years. And a wonderful community benefits agreement embedded in that decision to make sure that the jobs go locally, that people who've been formerly incarcerated are competitive for those jobs, that there are job training pipelines to help young people get into them, that the wages will be living wages, so really good stuff. We also know that we have wonderful programs around the country increasing the minimum wage, and the minimum wage campaigns are showing that this doesn't do the damage that so many naysayers say, but it actually makes the whole economy more robust, more people are engaged. It's good to talk about those things. So we need to use our strategies and our learnings to grow good jobs. That'll create equitable growth. We need to build capabilities. Emerald Cities is a wonderful example of taking all the retrofit dollars that came out of the stimulus and others that are there and making sure that we use those dollars to get young people in the pipeline, that they get those jobs, that they get training program that begins to get them ready for apprenticeships and unions, so that it's not just a job for a short period of time, but it's an opportunity that leads to a career. We need to really build capabilities. We need cradle-to-career programs, so that things like the Harlem Children's Zone that's now being realized through the Promised Neighborhoods program in communities all across the country that actually start at birth and make sure that we're building the capability of all of our children to be able to reach their full potential. We know how to do that. But we also have to erase barriers and create opportunities. Too many people in our communities have suffered from incarceration, and once they have been in, when they come out, they need to join the democratic process and vote. They need to join our communities and fully help with decision making, and most importantly, they need to get jobs. We need to ban the box that causes people to say, I have been incarcerated, and not even get considered. That should not come up unless it has something to do with that particular job. People should not have to make that declaration early. Ban the box, and that's happening all across the country. In the past 9 years, 56 communities have issued ban the box, and 10 states have done so. We need to stop the school-to-prison pipeline by dealing with school discipline, getting rid of zero tolerance, and we're seeing that happen in all kinds of places. And so what I have been trying to do, I hope not too quickly, but I hope that you have been able to follow it, is really make the point that we have a frame that is a powerful frame. And that frame needs to start off saying that the country is changing. That has to do with the demographics. That the demographics aren't just concentrated in a few places, they're everywhere. The future, in terms of when we become people of color, is actually now. Children are already in that position. We need to invest in children and make sure that they are ready. We need to get ready as a nation. Equity will make our economy stronger. You've got lots of economists to back you up, and equitable growth is possible. Not only are the American people ready for it, but our collective work has given us a policy agenda that will help drive that home. I think this frame could strengthen your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm now going to turn it over to Jennifer Tran, who's a program associate at PolicyLink, and she's going to talk about how we've been tailoring this framing and working with communities to help them use it and how they've been using it in their community action and policy work. I just wanted to let everybody know that we're going to make this webinar recording available to you all after the webinar is finished, and also the PowerPoint slides will be available to you as well. Also, you can chat in questions into the chat box now, but after Jennifer's done, we're going to open up the line so you'll be able to ask your questions. So you can hold them and ask them in a few moments. Now over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to talk about how we are using this framing and generating data to support the frame so that folks can make the argument that equity is a superior growth model, and share some examples of how people are doing it in different places throughout the U.S. So how do you measure equity in a region? And this is something that we've been working on with our partners at the USC Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. And we've been producing equity indicators for the top largest 150 metropolitan regions. And the way that we're doing this is we're defining equitable regions as places where all residents are able to participate in the region's economic vitality, contribute to the region's readiness for the future and connect to the region's assets and resources. And so we organize our indicators in these 4 buckets. Demographics tells us who's living in the region and how is it changing. Economic vitality shows us how the region's doing on economic growth and well-being. Readiness tells us how prepared residents are for the 21st century economy. And connectedness illustrates whether regions and neighborhoods are connected to one another and to opportunity. So what we've done with these indicators so far is we've produced a series of equity profiles, and we started with 4 regions that we're working closely with through the HUD Sustainable Communities grant program. And we've produced these profiles to give a comprehensive look at demographic, economic, health, and social indicators in the region so that planning organizations can develop regional plans that ensure investments are equitable, sustainable, and economically resilient. And since we can't produce profiles for all the regions in the U.S., we are working on sharing these indicators with the field through a website that we're calling the National Equity Atlas. And it's going to provide data for the largest 150 metropolitan regions and has these equity indicators that we've developed. Users will be able to explore their region through maps, charts, graphs, and to compare the metro's performance to other places in the U.S. The site should be live by fall of this year. So next I'm just going to provide some examples of how places are using the frame to support their local actions to advance equity. And as I previously mentioned, we created the equity profile for Rhode Island in partnership, and we did this in partnership with the Rhode Island statewide planning program. And through our equity analysis, we found that Rhode Island was experiencing slow population growth. The white population has been declining, but people of color have continued to grow rapidly. In fact, all of the growth in Rhode Island since 1998 is attributed to people of color, and the fastest growing groups in the state are Latinos. The state's going to continue to diversify through 2040 when every 4 in 10 residents will be people of color. At the same time, our indicators revealed that people of color in the state are faring the worst economically. Latinos in Rhode Island, we found, have the highest unemployment rate in the nation. So once we completed this analysis, our partners shared it with the governor's office, and it actually inspired the governor to enact an executive order on diversity to increase government job and contracting opportunities for people of color. They found that while people of color represent 24% of the population, there are only 15% of the state government employees. And since the state government is Rhode Island's largest employer with nearly 15,000 employees, the governor saw this as an opportunity to use state hiring and contracting policies to provide opportunities for communities in the state that needed it the most. Our next example comes from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And we've seen this framing gain a lot of traction in different arenas in the state. Minnesota is a really unique place because on the surface it has a really strong economy. It ranks really high in educational attainment, health, and overall prosperity. Yet people of color rank among the worst nationally. So in many cases, people of color in Minnesota are doing worse than their counterparts elsewhere in the country, despite all of this prosperity in the state. So in 2011, when PolicyLink hosted the National Equity Summit in Detroit and first introduced the framing, the Twin Cities region was in attendance as a delegation of over 170 local leaders. Many of these leaders had already been working together on transit equity issues, fighting for more stops in their community when the new light rail line was developed. They were inspired by the framing at the summit, went home, and formed a regional equity network called Equity Now Twin Cities. It includes nonprofits, public sector, and philanthropic partners working to advance equity in the region through transportation, planning, policy, and policy issues. In the regional planning arena, we've also seen leadership of the Met Council, the region's policy planning and service agency, really embrace the framework. Their chair, Susan Haig, often speaks about the importance of equity in the region's economic growth. And what you see is a quote from her recent State of the Region remarks where she says, investing in equity and opportunity is investing in regional growth. The Met Council plans to use its policies and investments to build a more prosperous region through equitable decision-making in their work around community engagement, housing, and transit. Also, following the summit in 2011, a group of funders from Minnesota approached PolicyLink and asked us to adapt the national frame and data to Minnesota. So Minnesota's Tomorrow takes the national framework and tailors the analysis to report on issues specific to the state. In 2 weeks, we're going to be releasing this report at a convening organized by the report's local advisory committee. And it'll bring over 200 attendees to catalyze a community dialogue about the economic imperative for equity in the state and to share examples of how equity is being achieved throughout communities in Minnesota and to provide concrete actions that participants can take back to their community. This next example is about how Kansas City has used data and framing to broaden their equity coalition and engage the business community. So Kansas City is another region that we developed an equity profile for. And our local partner there was the Mid-America Regional Council, the regional planning organization for Greater Kansas City. They're also a member of the Regional Equity Network. And like Rhode Island, the equity profile revealed that while the regional economy was performing relatively well, its future growth would be jeopardized if communities of color continued to fall behind. So as you can see from the chart, analysis showed that Latinos and Blacks don't have the educational levels that will be necessary for the region's future jobs. So Mark was really compelled by the findings of the report, and they've incorporated it into their own planning work, but also wanted to share the indicators with the local Chamber of Commerce because the Equity Network had not yet been able to engage the business community. As a result of the profile, Mark, the Chamber, and the Equity Network hosted a luncheon in October to jointly release the profile and to facilitate a discussion, particularly engaging the business community on why reducing inequality is key to the region's economic growth. The Chamber is now a member of the Equity Network and is actually leading the network's Economic Development Committee. And while the network is young, they're planning on focusing on education, transportation, and economic development. And their big project that they're just getting underway is an effort to redevelop a blighted community to build new affordable housing units, which is a priority identified through the equity profile since our analysis revealed that there was not enough affordable housing stock in the region and that many low-income communities and communities of color were not able to access jobs in the region. In California, we've seen this framing used to support policy campaigns for boys and men of color. In 2012, we produced California's Tomorrow, a short 4-page brief focused on policy priorities for the state, and released it with the California Tri-Caucus. The Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, which is a coalition of more than 24 local and statewide organizations, and the California Select Committee on Boys and Men of Color adopted the frame for their policy work. In 2012, the Select Committee released a policy platform with over 67 recommendations related to health, education, employment, violence prevention, and youth development. And the quote that you see here was used in the policy platform report, which makes the argument that given the state's demographics, we cannot afford to leave this segment of the population behind. As a result of these efforts, many laws passed over the last 2 years to improve, either directly or indirectly, the outcomes of boys and men of color in California. So in 2012, they passed 10 bills that came out of recommendations from the Select Committee. And just this last year, a whole series of policies were passed, including ban the box, access to driver's license for undocumented workers, changes to California's funding formula to distribute more tax dollars to low-income students, English learners, and FOSTs, and changes to school discipline policy changes which disproportionately impact boys and men of color. In New Orleans, we've seen advocates use this framing and data to inform workforce and economic development strategies. After we released our report in 2011, they used the framing and did a report using the similar data points and analyses that focused more on workforce and economic development strategies. And so through that analysis, they identified that they wanted to explore the unemployed population and found that 52% of Black men under age 25 were not working. And so this analysis really galvanized action to figure out how to connect this segment of the population to jobs. As a result, they're pursuing 2 different strategies. There's going to be a corridor revitalization, and which will include 2 hospitals, and they want to use that as a local hiring opportunity. And there's also a booming high-growth energy sector in New Orleans, and so they're trying to find ways to train workers because there's going to be more job openings than people who can fill them. And lastly, I just want to highlight our newsletter. It's a biweekly publication that highlights campaigns, leaders, policies, reports, and local models advancing equitable growth strategies. And if you sign up to receive our emails, then you will probably be already receiving this newsletter. But if not, then I've provided a link at the end of the of the presentation for you to sign up as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And we will also, before we make this PowerPoint available to you, we're going to add in some links to the reports that Jennifer mentioned, the equity profiles. We also have the policy agenda that Angela mentioned. We have a report about the policy agenda. So we're going to send you a slightly updated version that has a list of those resources so that they're easily accessible to you. So now we're entering the Q&A period. We have a good amount of time for questions and answers, 25 minutes. So what I'm going to start doing is going through the questions that you all have chatted in. And if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and then I will call on you and unmute your line, because right now all of your lines are muted just so that there's not feedback. And so we're going to start out with some of the chatted questions. So I think the first question is about do we get pushback? So Jenny Rempel, thank you for your question. When Angela or others present the case for equity as a superior growth model, which of the talking points receives the most pushback from various audiences, and how do PolicyLink staff respond to that pushback? The thing that I'm thinking of right now immediately, I think in general, we don't get that much pushback. I think among our network and a lot of folks that we're presenting to are equity advocates, and they see this framing as really useful to kind of add on to the way that they've already been talking about equity, and that the demographic change information and data can really be useful. I do think that in our audiences, sometimes we get pushback around people of color as an aggregate group, right? Because racial identity is a really complex thing, and not everybody feels like they're included in that definition. I think that, it is the growth in the Latino population predominantly that is driving demographic change, and some Latinos don't identify as people of color, right, because of the way that the census defines race, ethnicity, and how people feel about their own identities. So that's a complex issue, so I think that comes up sometimes. We've sometimes in the profiles adapted we've adapted the framing around demographics to fit the local conditions, and we've changed our framing overall, right? So in Southeast Florida, we recognize that there's a huge Black immigrant population, and so we added that into our data because the local community was like, hey, we're not, this isn't reflecting us. We try as much as possible to disaggregate data so that folks are feeling included in this framing around demographic change. In Detroit right now, we're adapting our data to try to get to the Middle Eastern population, and that's a bit challenging, but we're working with the data that we have available to do that, and when necessary going to secondary sources that are really looking at how the community is changing. I think that is, and then I think that equity and understanding the term equity and what that means and how is it different from equality, I think that's another big question that comes up, and how we address that is, I think a very simple way of addressing it is, equity is about, or equality is about giving everyone the same size shoes. Everyone gets size 7 shoes. It's about everyone getting an equal share of something. whereas equity is about giving everybody shoes that fit so they can run and jump and walk and get to where they need to go. Equity is really about tailoring solutions so that you are meeting the needs of each person, regardless of how far behind they are at. So I think that those are the main things. I'm going to look at other chat questions. Jennifer, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that. Okay, so here is a question that's good for Jennifer, though. Can this frame, this is from Carly Hare, I don't know exactly the last name pronunciation. Carly, thank you for your question. Can this frame be modified to create profiles for rural communities? I'm going to ask Jennifer to answer that because she's most familiar with the data.
Yes, I'd say for the most part, we can create these profiles for rural communities, and that's something that we're hoping to do in the near future as we select a few more regions to work with. But the challenge often with rural communities is the availability of data. And so depending on the size of the population and depending on the size of different racial ethnic groups, it can be a challenge if the sample size isn't large enough in the data to disaggregate the different people of color groups to provide detailed numbers on these indicators for them, then that can be an issue. But if the sample size is large enough and we have the data, then yes, we can adapt the framing and the indicators.
And I'd add that when we are able to make the National Equity Atlas website available to everybody around fall, or hopefully earlier, it will have data on states. So you could use the data at the state level. And I would just add in that the demographic change issue is very prominent and occurring in rural communities as well. In the Minnesota's Tomorrow report that we're going to release in a couple weeks, it shows that. I think you see it especially around rural industries like agricultural processing, food processing industries that are really drawing a new type of workforce to areas that are predominantly Latino. And in rural communities, it's oftentimes, or more smaller communities, you see this dynamic where they are losing population, but it's actually these new immigrant communities and communities of color that are changing that dynamic so that communities are either losing less population or they're growing because these communities of color are growing. And you see that you'll hear people talk about if they have commercial strips and commercial areas and businesses, that there's a lot of entrepreneurship among these communities. And so they're really breathing new life into these communities. I see that somebody has their hand up. Linda Cohen, I am going to unmute you once I figure, okay. Linda, hopefully you're ready to ask your question. I'm going to unmute you now. Linda, are you on the line?
I am, but I did not raise my hand.
Oh, okay. Do you have a question?
No, not at this point.
Okay, great. I'm just getting used to this new functionality with the hand raising. It does, okay. I don't know why it showed that you did. Okay, Betty, so how do I mute all?
Muted.
Okay, this is a little. Okay, I don't see. Okay, that's not working right now. I'm just going to check for other questions. Okay. Okay, so another question in the chat box. Has the frame been used to address health inequalities and disparities? This is a question from Mauricio Roman. I would say Yes, definitely. So PolicyLink has a Center for Health Equity and Place that's led by Mildred Thompson. There are others on that team. And they've had, for a long time, they've had a frame around why race and place matter, which is looking at how, as Jennifer was saying, we need to look at how places are supporting everybody to participate and prosper, as well as the people side of things in terms of equity and who's able to participate. And so our health equity team has been integrating the demographic change and economic imperative of equity into their work around health disparities, looking at, for example, we have a lot of work around access to healthy food, and that work is both about how do you deal with the food deserts issue, you know, that folks are living in low-income communities of color and they don't have access to grocery stores, or the corner stores in their communities don't have any fresh fruits and vegetables or healthy foods available. And we've been looking at that as an economic issue as well as a health issue. And so I think that this economic imperative and the need to bolster economic activity and strong growth in these communities is a great intersection of this work. And in our newsletter that Jennifer referenced, the America's Tomorrow newsletter, we've highlighted several examples of how increasing access to healthy food in communities is about strengthening the economy and improving health and increasing access to healthy foods. We recently talked about a corner store effort in Omaha that's changing the food that's available in the small stores in the community, and how that is actually also supporting the businesses and bringing about business, helping small businesses stay viable in these communities when oftentimes they're closing. I'm going to look at more questions here. How could an organization in rural communities of Arizona have access to the framework database to establish our points for existing inequality in our communities, as it seems like the public officials don't want to acknowledge that such inequality exists? I'm so tired and frustrated for lack of political power in our Latino communities. This is from Emma Torres. This is we were just in Angela and I were just in North Carolina this week, and people were experiencing and talking about the same frustration, right? You all, I don't know if anybody on the line is in North Carolina, but you might know or have heard of the Moral Mondays movement that's happening there, led by Reverend Ben Barber. And you know, they recently, up until 2 years ago, at the state level, the policy, they had very more progressive policy than in other areas in the South, and that's completely flipped because of redistricting and who's in power now, and now they have a lot of really terrible policies when it comes to low-income people and people of color. So I think that, Emma, you're hitting on an issue that a lot of folks are facing, and I think that your question about the lack of political power is huge. When we talk about our policy agenda, you have to look at democratic participation and who is able to participate in political decision making to get the policy changes that we want to see. So I think that these issues of democracy and building a strong economy are completely interrelated, and efforts like Southwest Voters Program, I think, which is in I think they're working in Arizona. They're definitely in California, and other efforts to really boost civic participation. I know a lot of the Marguerite Casey Foundation grantees, I know a lot of you all are working on that, and I think that's integral to moving this agenda forward in general. Okay, is there a policy that supports ladies and girls of colors, like you all have the California Boys and Men of Color? This is from Betty Petty, thank you. We've been talking about this a lot. I don't know if Jennifer, if you want to say something about how genders come into our, so So we're trying to increase in our database. We're trying to increase the amount of data and indicators that we have that address gender as an issue. So it would be boys and girls. But do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So we got feedback from some of our partners as we were producing the profile from Rhode Island, and they felt it was a critical issue to disaggregate the data by gender, and so that's something that we've been trying to do more of because we are finding significant differences between men and women, particularly in employment and wage indicators, and so that's something that we're trying to do more of, and we're mindful that it is also a gender issue in addition to race and ethnicity and nativity.
I would just to add to that, I know that there is an emerging effort that the White House and the Center for American Progress are working on that is around, they're framing it as working families, but it is to look at issues like paid leave and sick leave, paid leave and wages for working families, and they're trying to define it in a way that really gets to low-income working mothers and not just working mothers who are in, high-power corporate jobs who need workplace flexibility. Also important, but as you know from our work and the work you're doing, it is really the low-wage working mothers that have the most to juggle in terms of supporting their families. And so we think that that is really important. Angela, and we can include, I think that we can include this resource in the list that we send out. There's a recent Shriver Center report all about women in the workplace out by the Maria Shriver and the Center for American Progress. And Angela contributed a chapter that is all about this topic of low-income women and looking at demographic change and women of color and how we need policies that can address their needs. So I think that that's really a good resource for your question. It looks like we're not able to take questions from hands being raised. Is that correct? So we're just going to go through the chat questions and continue here. Thank you. Oh, okay, thank you. So there's a question from Shauna Sunrise. Thank you, Shauna, for your question. How would the framework serve both a Native American reservations and urban communities across the country? I'm actually going to ask Jennifer to address this since she's been working on it a little bit from the data side.
So this is another issue that comes up often, and so the way that we've been addressing it is we've been disaggregating data for Native American communities as we do these analyses and work on these profiles. And most recently, I'd say this issue came up in Minnesota, where there's a sizable Native American population. And so there it was most critical that I think we were able to show how Native Americans were doing in the state and to highlight the issues that were most relevant to them, because the strategies that are going to be necessary for advancing this frame are going to be different for every group. So for Native Americans, we were finding that their challenges were different than the African American community and the Latino community, and so the data really helped to support that.
And I wanted to highlight a couple of the examples that we've recently included in our newsletter too around Native American communities. So there was an article about the First Peoples Fund and how they're supporting Native American artists to support their work and so they can earn income for their art as an economic development strategy. And there was also a recent article about an interesting effort in, I think it's South Dakota, the Tonka Bars effort, which was all about, on the Native American reservation, they are taking recipes to create power bars that use buffalo meat. And so it's a very successful entrepreneurial effort that is really spurring economic development that is building assets and wealth of the community. as opposed to some other types of economic development strategies that sometimes the wealth goes outside of the community. And so they're trying to develop a co-op, an employer-owned co-op as well. So that was a really good example of equitable growth, I think. A question about has the frame been used from Marilyn Wynn, thank you. Has the frame been used in breaking barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated individuals? This is such a huge issue. It comes up every place that we talk about this. It is being used in our Boys and Men of Color. The frame is being used in our Boys and Men of Color work in California, the Select Committee for the Status of Boys and Men of Color, which Jennifer talked about. And they've been outlining policies and looking at the California budget and California policies and identifying policies that are the barriers to employment for formerly incarcerated individuals and really trying to remove those barriers and create more opportunities. And they've had some success in terms of ban the box. And we also highlight some examples in our newsletter of in Michigan, there's an employer-led effort. I think it's called 311 or something, but it's about engaging employers to make opportunities, employment opportunities available to formerly incarcerated individuals, which is interesting since it's employer-led. So yes, definitely, and such an important issue. From Angel Garcia, can diversity fit into the equation of equity? Is there a component for cultural identity assertion? I wish that we could hear a little bit more from you about that question, because I don't know if I have enough information to really answer it, but I think that diversity is, from my perspective, I think diversity and equity are very interrelated. When we talk about equity, we're really talking about how can we create policies, strategies that reach everyone, acknowledging the power and beauty of diversity. And so I think that equity is an approach that I think embraces diversity and really tries to reach that and create tailored solutions that reach everybody. I don't know if I'm answering your question, though, so I'm sorry, we can't have more of a conversation, so let's try to follow up, please. The last question chatted into the chat box is from Kate down the road at Casa Justa Just Cause. Hi, Kate. We're having trouble framing our work to funders. They want to make an impact on the national scale. This framing is very local. We want to build alliances that build on our collective national strengths. How can we use this data as a group? Oh, I really feel like this is such a great question for a discussion. I don't know if I can really do it justice here. We just have a few minutes left, but I would just say that, I mean, Kate, let's have a conversation. Let's schedule a phone call to talk about this. But we are, in terms of how we see this, we do see this as a broad framing, not a local framing, right? So these issues, you know, demographic change, as Angela presented the data at the beginning of the webinar, this is happening everywhere. This is impacting all communities. The important part that we're trying to do is understand it's happening differently in all communities, so it is important to be able to tailor the framing, and folks always say we need the local data, but this is the national story. By 2043, we will be a majority people of color nation. Right now, 51% of babies being born are of color, so this is America's issue. I think that's how Angela is always talking about it. You know, this is our national challenge and opportunity, and if we don't take steps now to get rid of barriers that are based on race and class, you know, and enable everyone to participate in the economy and build the next economy that we all want, a shared prosperity economy, and deal with inequality, because inequality isn't just bad for those that are being left behind, you know, in the communities that have been left behind, the people who've been left behind. It is a problem for everybody, you know, as Angela said, it's not just, we're not the only ones saying it, you know, as little equity groups, you know, pushing at the powers that be. This is a national issue that economists at the the Federal Reserve are pointing to, at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're looking at this, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, they're looking at this across countries, so it's not even a national issue, it's a global issue, that inequality is happening everywhere, and it's bad for countries' growth and prosperity, and it's bad for equity. So there is one more question before we close, it looks like. So Shauna, another from Shauna Sunrise, there's a huge conference next week by the National Center for American Indian Enterprises Development in Las Vegas. So folks, we can send this out again in the email just because I think it's something she wants everybody to know about. If anyone's interested, go to www.ncaled.org. Shauna is attending on behalf of Americans for Indian Opportunity. AIO.org for more information on their projects and Indigenous leadership building. So thank you very much for that information. We are at 10:59 here in Oakland. Thank you all for joining and for your questions, and I hope that we can have more conversations. Also, we are going to, as we close, you will see a quick survey, and we're going to ask you some questions about how this framing can help you, what PolicyLink can do, what resources we can provide to help you use this framing in your work, and please give us feedback. We are constantly adapting this framing and trying to think of new ways that we can provide advocates like you with this information. So thank you so much. Have a terrific day, and please let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.